Welcome back to Legitimate Targets, everybody. I hope you're all having a great day. We are joined by a very special guest today, Matt Ehret. He is really the premier expert on all things related to Canadian history, British Canada, U.S. history, and the politics of all of these major power players and how they're actually shaping the world today. You can find his work at thecanadianpatriot.org. He's got an incredible YouTube channel. He's an author, tons of great books, and really amazing videos that I highly suggest you all check out. Some new documentaries as well. So without further ado, Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. I think before we get into any of the, current day events, I think it would serve the broader audience in this conversation if you could provide us with a brief summary of how Canada, as a country, and before it was a country, when it was just a British territory, has been used as a very, very strong weapon against U.S. sovereignty and the economic success of the United States. Again, developing the United States in our own sovereign economic manner. Many Americans are not aware of this history, but I think to understand the world today, they should be. Especially as it relates to the presidency of Donald Trump, big tech coming in. What is this all about? Donald Trump's plans to take Canada and Greenland. What is really going on there? So if you could, I think it would be an excellent way to start off this conversation.
Yeah, I could do my best in a short period, and it's an honor to be joining you. I've been a long-time admirer of your show, so this is a joy and a pleasure. And indeed, due to certain circumstances, the issue of Canada as a strategic pawn within a broader great game has come back into people's focus with discussions about the question of transforming Canada into the 51st state, which may or may not be a good thing. It really depends upon a variety of dynamics, which I'll touch upon, but your question is an important one, and I'll do my best. But I think in the context of my research and my publication, the Canadian Patriot Review, and I've written a 4-volume book series. Well, I've written 3 of the 4 volumes called The Untold History of Canada, where I tried to piece together this enigma that is Canada as a very strange structure. Legally, culturally, it's looks and sounds quite American as far as getting to talk to Canadians who speak English. There's McDonald's. There's a lot of similar cultural dynamics as we see in America in the United States, as in Toronto or Montreal. But there's something very weird. It's also a monarchy. We've got things like hereditary institutions, the Governor General as the legal hand of the Queen or King. We've got lieutenant governors who are always, if you go back until really 2004, 2005, it was always, and now it's about 80% of the time, the lieutenant governors stationed in each province overseeing giving royal assent to legislation passed from the Houses of Commons are members of things like the Knights of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, knights or dames, which is part of the vetting process, I think, for the general system of control and command, which goes back to the 19th century when they set this thing up as a monarchy. With that particular confederation idea. And one of the points I've gotten across in my volumes, especially volume 2 of The Untold History of Canada, is that there's no such thing as Canadian history. There's world history, and you could situate Canada within that. So from that standpoint, the current legal system that we have, which again has a privy council, unelected appointed officials with an enormous amount of power, deputy premier or deputy ministers who get appointed, who are managing much of the deep state structure that is embedded within the Canadian system, was set up in the wake of the Civil War in America. So that's something that I document, how many of the assassinations of American leaders, including John F. Kennedy, Abraham Lincoln, can't be accounted for if you don't look at the role of Canada, and specifically in the case of Lincoln, the Confederacy operations, the Confederate intelligence operations that were at that time handled and managed by Colonel George Saunders, a high-level Mazzini devotee, very, very high up in British intelligence, who was based in Montreal and who provided a lot of the support, the grooming of John Wilkes Booth in Montreal, where he was for 5 weeks. before being sent down to take part in the murder of Lincoln. And one of the polemics I've gotten across in the books is that the British Empire in the 19th century had two anti-American Confederate plots or dynamics in play, one of which being a Southern Confederacy, which failed, and the other one being a Northern Confederacy, which succeeded. So a lot of the problems that America has suffered from as far as the grooming growth of the American deep state can't really be understood, or the murder of great American presidents. And I alluded to JFK, who even Jim Garrison, the district attorney from New Orleans, made the point in his 1991 book on the Trail of the Assassins, was directed in large measure by a Anglo-Canadian operation called Permindex, run by a guy who ended up working closely with Prince Philip and Maurice Strong by the name of Major General Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, who ran this assassination bureau as a front that also was trying to kill Charles de Gaulle and a variety of other leading statesmen of the 1960s who were resistant to this Malthusian takeover. Again, that was Montreal. So there's this thing here, and there's something good and legitimate about Canada, which at the best of times has seen really good souls who were able to work with a Charles de Gaulle, work with a JFK, work with a Franklin Roosevelt, who attained some form of political power and did good things for good people or for the citizenry. But much of the time, too much of the time, we've been sort of a synthetic construct designed specifically to help grow a North American deep state structure loyal to interests that have nothing to do with Canadians or Americans.
Again, the history you lay out, Matt, is so unknown. They don't teach this in the history books, I guess with good reason. There's a very, very good reason why they don't mention any of this stuff. And it has a lot to do with this Malthusian ideology, which I'd love for you to explain to the audience next. And, as you were talking and mentioning all this stuff, I had laying right beside me, I have this picture of from Harper's Weekly of Henry Carey, who I'm sure you're probably going to address as you bring up this next answer to the question I have. But, it's incredible that so many people don't know this, but also that they think that the rivalry between the U.S. and the United Kingdom ended in 1776. They don't know about 1812. They don't know about the Civil War. They don't know about the competing economic interests and beliefs. They really don't know, and it's a shame. So what is this Malthusian ideology? How has the UK weaponized this against the United States for years and years now? And really, how is it culminating today in American politics?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll tackle the second part first, which is Thomas Malthus. For those of the viewers that may not be aware, was a leading grand strategist, a mathematician, and a pastor, a man of the cloth, who was employed at the British Empire's Haileybury College, which was the official college that trained the managers of the British East India Company, which was sort of the arm, the strong arm of the British Empire as the primary one world government for about two centuries. And he was authoring a pamphlet or a book that is still taught in many universities. I don't know of any university that doesn't have Malthus's works in their bookstores, even to this very day, called An Essay on the Principle of Population, whereby he introduces his mathematical ratio for scientific engineers to scientifically manage global populations based on what he believed was this amazing breakthrough of an insight that population growths always occur at a geometric growth function, whereas food can only at best grow arithmetically, and as such, there will always be foreseeable population crises as we exceed our carrying capacity, the ability for Earth to sustain a growing number of people. And so with this formula, he basically said that now we have an ability to act preventatively on future crises by encouraging, and he calls for it in his first volume, the first edition of his book, the gifts that God has given us as far as speaking to members of the British Empire, his fellow anti-humanists, these gifts of the plague, of war, of famine. He calls for the elimination of the unfit, of babies that exceed a certain capacity of the state to support should be eliminated. And it's very brutal. Now, he won over a lot of devotees, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill. I would say pretty much every high-level player in the British Empire's machinery in the 19th and into the 20th century were disciples, devotees of Malthus. John Maynard Keynes was a devoted follower of Malthus, wrote treatises celebrating Malthus's brilliance. So basically, it was an excuse. And you mentioned Henry C. Carey. That is a wonderful figure to read. His Harmony of Interests, his Unity of Law. These are wonderful books. He was a leading advisor to Abraham Lincoln, a key economist who was organizing an international network of economists based upon the refutation of Malthus's dismal theory. That's why they called it the dismal science, because it was based upon basically killing people to make space for the more fit. And Carey's opposition to Malthus was premised on the fact that Malthus completely ignored the existence of creativity, technological progress, the means by which human creative thought can tap into discoveries of the universe and translate those into better forms of technology that allow us to supersede nature's limits to growth, the carrying capacity, which for animals is relatively absolute for bunny rabbits and wolves, whereas for humans it's relative to the cultural and scientific discoveries and improvements that we have or have not made. So again, Carey was a fantastic representative of this better tradition that emerged out of the American Revolution of recognizing that money, that political economy was not something for the benefit simply of an elite to manage over a slave class, as it had been under the perverse fake capitalisms promoted by the British Empire or the City of London for centuries, but was rather based upon the increase of the quality of mind, the objects of enterprise that the mind could increase as a bounty. So Carey's work, just like Friedrich List, just like Alexander Hamilton earlier, and many others, Henry Clay, are invaluable resources for people to get a sense of what was that better tradition and what were American presidents who were standing up in opposition to their deep state structures embedded and enshrined in things like the Skull and Bone Society, in Wall Street, in the northern and southern branches of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, which is behind the breakup of the Union in the 1850s, 1860s, especially under the Civil War. You can't account for any of that if you don't look at a lot of these operations within America that, again, were never loyal to the interests of America per se, but were always receiving directives, prompts from an agency far removed from the North American continent, and I would say mostly driven at that time, as probably still to a large measure today, in the City of London, which is a square mile with supranational jurisdiction outside of even the authority of the nation of England per se, that has embedded fifth columnists in a variety of nations, and the U.S. has been a high focus. Now, for the second part of that question that I'm kind of pressing on now, for those who believe that Britain has been an ally of America, there's been good English people and sometimes good English statesmen now and again, occasionally, but not too often. But it's more than the people of England or even the political players. Jeremy Corbyn was a decent guy, but because he was a decent guy, he had to get taken down by this thing, which is also working hard to undermine America from within. Now, I've got a quote here that I'm going to read that I think just give the essential idea of the schism of paradigms. And I've written a 4-volume book series called The Clash of the Two Americas that expands upon this in a greater detail. But this is a quote from a fellow named Lord Lothian. Their names sometimes are a little bit, they smell like a little bit of a Star Wars-y type of name, Lord Lothian. To a fellow named Lionel Curtis. Lord Lothian's his human name was Philip Kerr. And this is a 1918 letter at the end of World War I. They had just got the U.S. enmeshed to support the Britain in the war, which was, again, an artificial bankers' war that didn't really have any justification beyond destroying Russia and undermining a variety of countries, the Ottoman Empire, that Britain wanted to undermine in order to consolidate some form of world control. And at the time, again, there was a lot of effort since the murder of McKinley in 1902 to create an Anglo-American special relationship, which was done under Teddy Roosevelt. It was expanded upon by Woodrow Wilson. Eugenics, which is sort of a retooled Malthusianism, was blossoming all over North America and Europe at that time. Eugenics being basically the science of weeding out the unfit, controlling human populations scientifically. There's negative and positive eugenics, but it grew out of thinkers who were devoted followers of Malthus's worldview, including both Charles Darwin and Francis Galton. So at the time, there was, again, this aggravating annoyance from members of the British High Command, and Lord Lothian represents something big. So he's writing in frustration to Lionel Curtis, that saying 1918, there is a fundamentally different concept in regard to this question between Great Britain and the United States as to the necessity of civilized control over politically backward peoples. The inhabitants of Africa and parts of Asia have proved unable to govern themselves. Yet America not only has no conception of this aspect of the problem, but has been led to believe that the assumption of this kind of responsibility is iniquitous imperialism. They take an attitude towards the problem of world government exactly analogous to the one they earlier took towards the problem of world war. If they are slow in learning, we shall be condemned to a period of strained relations between the various parts of the English-speaking world. We must get into the heads of the Canadians and Americans that a share in the burden of world government is just as great and glorious a responsibility as participation in the war. So this guy is he's a leading member of the Cecil Rhodes Milner Roundtable Group. The Roundtable is an organization that was set up with the funds, the money that had been looted from Africa by Cecil Rhodes, who had also sponsorship by the Cecil family. No relation. Lord Gascoigne Cecil was the British Prime Minister during the Civil War, who called for supporting the Confederates, which he did, which Britain actually did do, providing them war munitions, weapons, directives, logistics, warships that Britain was building. Britain actually had to pay the world's first reparations to America in 1872 for having provided the Southern Confederacy with all of the warships. Now, that was done overseen by Lord Palmerston, Lord Gascoigne Cecil. Cecil was a sponsor of the Roundtable movement. And these guys set up several entities, number one being a thing that came to be known as Chatham House. The Royal Institute for International Affairs is sort of the queen of think tanks with branches in various English-speaking colonies, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. The one that they set up in America after World War II, which was actually spearheaded by this guy Lothian and Lionel Curtis, was called the Council on Foreign Relations. That was sort of what Hillary Clinton called the mothership. So that's, again, a Rhodes operation, a Cecil Rhodes Trust operation. And then to staff it, what they did is they created a new system of indoctrination by providing what are known as Rhodes scholarships to Americans, Canadians, basically colonials, to be brainwashed in Oxford and then to be resent back to their local country to participate in a multi-generational infiltration and takeover, often interfacing very closely with Fabians who had been indoctrinated in the London School of Economics. Fabians being like John Maynard Keynes and a variety of others, H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, were Fabians at different times. So what they're basically trying to do and get across is that we need to transform, break the anti-imperial traditions of the America that broke free of the empire in 1776, that established this alternative system of thinking about political economy based upon protectionism, national banking, productive credit. What are you doing for the future? How are you upgrading the quality of life and leaping over the limits to growth? How do we break that away and bring out some form of a new Anglo-American hegemony-oriented way of thinking, which was their primary obsession for the entirety of the 20th century? And since our chat here is dealing with the infiltration of this thing, I've got a second quote. Well, Franklin Roosevelt is a guy who I've come to respect enormously. And he was, naval secretary or assistant secretary for the Navy in World War I. He developed during that time a pretty good sense of the sabotage operations of England and Germany inside of America at that time. And when I say Germany, I don't mean the German people again. I'm talking about Aleister Crowley, who was operating as a triple agent or a double agent for Britain, but acting like a German spy, along with a whole network with deep claws into Washington, D.C., to ensure that there would be some form of controlled demolition of society that would be World War I. And Roosevelt was briefed. I've got a little image here of a program in 1920 that was called Defense Scheme Number 1 that the British had set up to invade and destroy America. So I have this little image taken from a book that was recently published of the declassified program for Defense Scheme 1, which involved British troops, again, just like they had in the Civil War, where there were British troops stationed in Canada. I think it was about 40,000 British troops ready to receive orders to attack Lincoln from the north while he was fighting the Confederacy in the south. That was something which was thwarted because of Russia, and specifically Tsar Alexander II, who intervened, saying, no, if you do this officially, then this will be casus belli with Russia. And so that was enough of a threat to put down England and also France, which had troops stationed in Mexico, ready to attack the U.S. from the south during the Civil War. So a similar rehashing was done after World War I, based on the fact that there were a number of American patriotic figures within the military, within military intelligence, within the political, within Congress, that understood the British imperial danger. And so they put forth this scheme to attack and destroy America through Canada. And so I've got this little graph there. This is 1920. This was done. FDR had gotten wind of it and had a counter response in 1930 called War Plan Red, which involved a program for the United States to declare war on the British Empire, which also involved Japan, which had a special relationship with Britain. So I've got an image here of War Plan Red, which most Canadians have been fed. They only know, if they know about this at all, they only know about War Plan Red as proof of evil American imperialism, which has really traumatized psychologically many Canadians over generations, that's all America wants, is to be the big bad empire to take us over. And I'm not saying that Trump's current messaging currently to take Canada as a state is necessarily a good thing. I'm not saying that, but it's not necessarily a bad thing either. There's again factors at play. At this time, this was a counter response to Britain's threats to destroy America, and this is a more expanded version of the war plan that involved Japan attacks on Pearl Harbor on the West Coast in California, an invasion force from Mexico going north, as well as, again, the invasion force from Canada. Again, British troops. That was a bigger part of Defense Scheme Number 1. This was taken over. This was co-opted by the Germans. So the scheme didn't fully disappear, Defense Scheme 1. It was just sort of changed a little bit, whereby you had, in a Life magazine 1942 edition, you had all of these different graphs that came out of invasion plans by the Germans and the Japanese to invade the United States from several directions. Here's one of those directions, Plan Number 2, with an invasion force into San Francisco, simultaneously as the Germans would go, like the British were planning to do earlier, through South America and up through Panama into the United States from the south. And a third, there's 6, but this is the third simultaneous program or plan, which would involve taking Greenland and then invading the U.S. from Canada. This is, again, a German program that was declassified or was discovered during the war. But again, the British were not necessarily against Hitler. Neither were, not from the standpoint of the higher grand strategists. And just like we had in the case of Prescott Bush, we had many of the Wall Street upper brass. You had the DuPonts, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, who had poured a fortune into the growth of fascism as the economic miracle solution to the Great Depression that they also orchestrated. The growth of eugenics also as a science under the Rockefeller sponsorship was done in Germany. It was done in Canada, the United States. 30 U.S. states had eugenics, forced sterilization policies to manage the unfit. and bankers. I mean, like I said, Prescott Bush had made a fortune investing in the German war machine, and he wasn't alone. So you had this whole fifth column inside of the United States, inside of England, where you had Montague Norman working closely with Hjalmar Schacht, the German Reichsminister, in growing again the German financial machinery, helping and assisting Germany in expansion and annexation of Czechoslovakia, of Austria, of Poland. That a lot of this was done, as Alex Krainer, a fantastic analyst, has pointed out, through back channel diplomacy overseen by the British. And it was really just at a certain point that Hitler was becoming a bit of a Frankenstein monster, listening to his generals, not going along with the plan that he was supposed to be obedient to, which was just go destroy Russia. And his generals were telling him, no, you don't do that directly. You have to consolidate your south. And he started getting ideas in his mind that the New World Order could be led by the Nazi Reich, whereby the British could be the junior partners, instead of the British Empire running the show and Hitler and Mussolini as the junior partners. So some British agents or operatives were more than happy to go along with that, including the king, the Nazi King Edward VIII, including Neville Chamberlain, including Lloyd George, a very close figure to Lord Milner of the Round Table. Were very happy to Oswald Mosley, the head of the British Union of Fascists, were very happy to accept that. Others, like Churchill and Churchill's groupings, were not so happy to do that. Leo Amory was among the Churchill grouping who said, no, let's abort this. We overstepped our common sense here. We can live to fight another day. So it doesn't mean that the British fighting Germany made Britain necessarily good. It just meant they wanted to put down an operation that got out of control. And FDR, again, had a very good awareness of these things. And there's a quote that I'm going to read here too. And as I hope I've implicitly answered part of that question, where he's talking to his son, Elliot Roosevelt, in 1943, after he had meetings with Winston Churchill and with Stalin, and was negotiating what the post-war world was going to look like. And would it be based upon a new Anglo-American empire, or would it be based upon the United States helping colonial people to become sovereign, industrialized, independent, through the reactivation of the Henry C. Carey program that he had done under the New Deal, which was very much in harmony with the protective tariff programs, state projects that would be built by large-scale productive credit, as FDR did, following again the thinking of Lincoln and Carey through the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. So there was a definite schism where FDR wanted the world managed primarily by a special relationship of Russia, China, and the United States as the dominant partners. And Britain would be dragged along into that new type of behavior. And then you had the British Empire system of John Maynard Keynes and Winston Churchill, who had a very different idea that, no, we have to continue to subdue the dark-skinned inferior races on behalf of the Ubermenschen, right? The more than humans. And so this last quote I've got here, and there's a picture of FDR with Mackenzie King, the prime minister, who was a bit confused, but not a bad guy. They had a pretty good relationship of Canada. And he says here to his son, 1943, saying, any number of times the men in the State Department have tried to conceal messages to me, delay them, hold them up somehow, just because some of those career diplomats over there aren't in accord with what they know I think. They should be working for Winston. As a matter of fact, a lot of the time they are working for Churchill. Stop to think of them. Any number of them are convinced that the way for America to conduct its foreign policy is to find out what the British are doing and then to copy that. I was told 6 years ago to clean out that State Department. It's like the British Foreign Office. So unfortunately, he did die in his fourth term, just a few months in. He was not there to oversee the UN conference in 46 that in San Francisco that set the stage for what the UN was going to be. His enemies at the CFR took over. Truman immediately, started gushing over Winston Churchill's wisdom and established the Anglo-American special relationship, created the Truman Doctrine, turned the United States increasingly into a Frankenstein monster again, or some form of a beast of. There's a fellow named Mike Billington who used the imagery of a dumb giant on a leash. So America increasingly became transformed into a dumb giant, acting as the might, the brawn for the run by the British brains in the Cold War period. And all of those alliances with Russia, with China, were abolished in favor of this new type of arrangement. And JFK tried to bring it back to a certain degree. Eisenhower, in a weak way, kind of tried, but he was very weak. JFK was stronger, but I think a little bit naive, though still tried to revive this system of this American system. And we hadn't really seen a lot of it since JFK and his brother were murdered. There was not really much coming out of the White House until 2016, when there was a certain sense of, or a certain revival in a limited way, of some of those better traditions with Trump. Although again, there's all sorts of operatives and snakes abounding in and around his vicinity that make me uncertain whether he's capable of withstanding the pull of this imperial faction.
Your rich analysis speaks for itself. Again, I just can't stress enough how much I think everyone needs to hear this. I wish that we could get you set up on Tucker Carlson to talk about all this, because I think it would be the perfect venue to do so. Especially with someone like Tucker, who shares a common distrust, I think is a very light way of putting it, for the British system and Malthusian economics. But anyways, you mentioned in your last answer, you mentioned the Civil War, War of 1812, these things. You also mentioned McKinley, Kennedy. I'm curious, to what degree do you believe, because you've written about this, as I understand, to what degree do you believe that the UK was involved in the assassinations and assassination attempts of, former U.S. presidents? And also, I'm wondering, do you believe that, given the fact that FDR was kind of challenging this British banking cartel order, that possibly the British were involved in the efforts to institute term limits for presidents in the United States? You had FDR. He was in the middle of his fourth term, if I'm correct, and he died in the middle of his fourth term. And then magically after, everyone was like, oh, we can't have someone like that. We can't have someone who's popular and doing all this, breaking up of banks and monopolies, and we can't have him serving infinite terms just because he's popular with the people. So we will have term limits now. How much influence do you think the UK had in these actions?
Yeah, no, I think those are potent questions, and not simple ones necessarily. When I look at, the reason why I gave my book series the title "Clash of the Two Americas," again, volumes 1 to 4, was because, and there's actually a version translated in the Russian market too, for those Russian speakers who might want to check it out. Is that the worst dynamic, or the worst part of the United States, this thing that we've more recently come to call deep state, but it's always been there, and I've, we've been alluding to it this whole chat so far. It's not American in pedigree. It came out through those operatives. Just like in Operation Gladio, you had these stay-behinds, these Nazi stay-behinds, as far as a NATO secret army that continued to run operations and were never punished, though they should have been, for the crimes against humanity that were committed during World War II. Instead, no, they were given new assignments by Alan Dulles, by the chiefs of NATO, to become a globally extended paramilitary organization, very, very controlled, but also very opaque, embedded in South America, embedded in the Middle East, embedded all across the United States and Europe and Canada. Similarly, going back to 1776 or 1781, after the British had surrendered, there was, coming out of that war, authentic American patriots who risked everything and were able to come up with something better than they started with, as far as like a system for the first time organized around a rejection of hereditary institutions, and the idea that all men, as an ideal, although it was not practiced perfectly by a long measure, but still as a concept, very important legal idea that all men are created equal, made in the image of God, that rights exist because we're human and are not something that can be given or taken away. the consent of the governed being the basis of the authority of law. These were all new ideas that had never been, they'd been thought about, but they hadn't been done before. So many people, there were leaders who came out of the revolution who were authentic patriots. Then there were those who didn't want to have anything to do with the revolution, and they were the United Empire loyalists. They were given sanctuary, just like a lot of the Russian traders in the 90s who were given a lot of influence and affluence by gobbling up state-owned enterprises. At a certain point, it became more expedient for them to avoid jail by leaving Russia and getting sanctuary in safer terrain, often in England, or in other parts of the Commonwealth, which is still a problem. Chinese traders as well have received a lot of support and sanctuary. So too did the American traders, who were given sanctuary in Canada. That's why Canada has English speakers today. That's why there is a Canada. And then you had the third aspect, what I would say would be the stay-behinds, those who acted like patriots on the surface, but always had their loyalties to the system of the British Empire. And you've got people like Aaron Burr, like most of the figures who ended up dominating the Federalist Party, but also there was no clean party in America, and that's why George Washington also said, America, if it's going to survive, can never have party politics. If it just can't allow itself to do that, which unfortunately became the name of the game by the 19th century. But all that to say, you had these traders, and they began to set up, as Aaron Burr did, using money that he effectively stole from what was supposed to be a civil works project around a water program. He basically co-opted that money, created the Bank of Manhattan, which became the foundational bank for what became Wall Street as a hub of the City of London financial system inside of America. And from there, you had the growth of this thing, so that when I look at the murder of American presidents, you were asking how many American presidents were killed by Britain. Oftentimes, the way this game works is that, empire works very hard, or the imperial grand strategists work very hard at getting other people to do their dirty work. And there was an idea that George Sorel popularized based on his studies of Venice and the Venetian methods known as the Tertius Gaudens, the third that wins. And this guy is basically a social engineer of the early 20th century who was studied by a lot of these imperialists. And, it's basically the idea that the person who can, the conspirator who can place as many separations between the thought that they have as conspirators with a plan of action, and the actual effects in the material world, the more points of separation you can have, the more fit you are to be the prima inter pares, the first among equals, right? The top alpha dog of the empire. So there's often proxies. And so whether I look at, but you'll always see evidence of this. So you have this, if you look at the growth of the deep state inside of America, this multi-generational thing that involves taking and corrupting a lot of the leading families, the Snell family, the Lamonts, the DuPonts later on, the Rockefellers later on. But I mean, a lot of these families became sort of a subversion of the English aristocracy, but with a lower level American ass sniffing quality to them. You got the Canadian aristocracy had a similar thing to it, always loyal to the old money that goes back to the days of the of the Roman Empire and the old patrician class, which is where you start getting like the real old money. Some of them seeded themselves into the Americas. Other ones remained back and allowed some new blood, some new families, some new mercenary families or dynasties to come in, like the Bushes, low level but still useful mercenary dynasties. And so when you look at either the murder of McKinley, that was managed by an anarchist terror sect that had been grown out of a sort of, I think it was in Buffalo. There's so many anarchist communes. It's kind of mind-boggling in the 19th and early 20th century to look at how many anarchist communes were set up. The Oneida Colony was another one in northern state New York, where the assassin of James Garfield was sent out of with the obsession to kill Garfield. He had a handler. It was sort of this weird sex colony, a pseudo-Christian Gnostic sex colony of free love. That was the Oneida Colony. and they were around for 50 years. They produced what looks to me, when I read the writings of some of these weird brain dead freaks, like this kid who was sent out, didn't have a sense of his own identity when he left to just kill President Garfield. It kind of reminds me a little bit of what I've seen about the assassin order that was working with the Templars. And I don't want to get too off topic, but I'm just going to throw it out there as an assassin secret society that had given young men a lot of sensual experience, a whole hallucinogenic experience in different little gardens of paradise and earthly delights, and then were sent back to carry out assassinations of Saladin or anybody who was trying to arrange peace between the Christians and the Muslims during the Crusades. So similar things were done inside of America as experiments, it seems. And in the case of Emma Goldman, who was an anarchist who oversaw this colony that unleashed this Polish anarchist in 1901 or 1902 to kill McKinley, she went to jail at a certain point, was bailed by Bertrand Russell. She was a member of the Neo-Malthusian League. So you've got these traces that she's got connections to high-level British intelligence operatives. Again, I referred to Lincoln's murderer, Wilkes Booth, but who was part of a broader conspiracy, and there were 4 people hung to death or hanged after Lincoln was murdered for the conspiracy to kill Lincoln. I don't know if Booth's body was ever necessarily found, but what is known is that he had a $500 money order signed by the governor of the Bank of Ontario, which was ironically located in Montreal, Henry Starnes, who then became mayor of Montreal as a reward for good deeds in 1865. He personally signed the money order to Wilkes Booth, which was found in his belongings in the United States after Lincoln was murdered. And again, Anglo-Canadian operations were given over to the Confederate intelligence to use as an intelligence hub, where things like the Albany raids, terrorist programs were launched throughout the Civil War from Canada, from Toronto, from Kingston, from Montreal, to destabilize Lincoln from the north the whole time. So there's all sorts of, again, you often won't see a direct, like, one-to-one causal relationship of, like, here's a British hand directly doing this bad thing, but you'll see proxies, as is so often the case.
And
the question on the term limits, I don't know if there was a direct British hand in that, but I do suspect that you're correct, that they want, because I mean, what other job in society does that, right? Like, if you're doing your job well at what and doing it effectively, will you get fired because you've exceeded your term limits? It's like, if you're doing it, you're willing to die, you've got insight, wisdom, experience, connections, capacities. Will we just demand all of a sudden that president go become a lawyer or something, like get a new job? And I think that there was a fear that somebody like an FDR might emerge that could carry out a positive anti-imperial policy, which often would likely take more than 2 terms to get done. So they had to make sure that wouldn't happen again.
You've brought up the subject of Canada and Trump's vision to liberate Canada and Greenland several times, so I think we should address it. Where does this come from? Because I can't imagine Donald Trump just woke up one morning and was like, oh, we should take Canada, or we should take Greenland. I'm very concerned about what he's saying with regard to Mexico, the Panama Canal, the Caribbean, some of his comments there. But when it comes to Canada and even Greenland, there is the possibility that it goes in one of 2 ways. There's the possibility that this could be something good, which I think is the extremely overly optimistic take to have here. That being that, this is a push for American sovereignty in the face of British, imperialism and control. This is a push for American resource sovereignty. Okay, that's one way of looking at it. The other way, which is probably what we're seeing, is that someone whispered in his ear, and, there's a lot of weird forces, dark forces in this Trump administration, big tech forces, people who a few years ago were, the most opposed people in the world to Donald Trump, and they were pushing all this woke nonsense, but now they've abandoned that. It's like they created a straw man almost, and now are acting like the heroes after being the villains for so long. But it seems like something is influencing Donald Trump to do this. And you look at, aggression against Russia or China, combating Russia through putting new military posts or nuclear capable, missiles in some of these regions, like in Russia or in Canada or in Greenland, or the possibility of accessing and combating Russia's control of the Northern Sea trade routes, like these sorts of things. It very well could be something that's aimed to bolster NATO's strength rather than hinder it. So where do you think this is all going, and where did this come from? Where did Donald Trump come up with this? How did he just wake up some morning and decide, yeah, we should take Canada? Because I've been saying we should do this for a long time. Tucker Carlson has been also hinting at it recently. But I'm just very surprised to see Trump talking about this. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm withholding absolute judgment on this because there's certain things that we just don't fully know. I am concerned that this is going sour. This could be an ugly expression of this policy, as you alluded to. I'm reassured a little bit. So the part of me that gives me something optimistic to hold on to, that it might be a legitimate positive thing, has a lot to do with what Trump had been doing in his first term. So, for example, despite all of the sabotage operations, he did seem to exhibit the greatest clarity about the nature of this treacherous fifth columnist operation. He kicked out, for example, or fired Sir Kim Darush, the British ambassador, when it was discovered that the British were involved in trying to push Trump towards a new war in the Middle East and to control his field of perception. You had things like the Integrity Initiative, another British-based, a UK-based think tank that had deep penetrations into Trump circles. Still to this very day, Sebastian Gorka has a lot to explain for being very close to the leadership of Integrity Initiative. But that was another part of the sabotage operation embedded to undermine what Trump had been trying to do as far as de-enmeshing the U.S. from commitments to NATO, to the World Health Organization, to restoring protective tariffs by abolishing NAFTA, which are all things I support. Getting rid of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that would have isolated China from its Pacific neighbors and put corporations into a position of authority over nation states, as was done under NAFTA. So his kiboshing of those things was all good, forcing some cooperation on the military front in Syria with the Russians was also a positive thing. Defunding to a large measure the National Endowment for Democracy, that was a big thing. De-enmeshing the CIA from conventional military forces. These were all good things that I pay attention to and that have a place in my mind when I'm fielding these types of questions or these considerations. And I think, despite the pandemic thing, whatever the hell that was, that derailed so many of these positive discussions between Trump and his Chinese and Russian colleagues, there was still anomalies that I hold on to. Like, for example, I have an image here where Trump had said on April 5th, 2019, he just invited the vice premier of China into the Oval Office, didn't announce it to anybody, just said, okay, here he is. They did a press conference together. And he said, between Russia, China, and us, we're all making hundreds of billions of dollars worth of weapons, including nuclear, which is ridiculous. I think it's much better if we all got together and didn't make these weapons. Those three countries, I think, can come together and stop the spending and spend on things that are more productive towards long-term peace. So that's a quick little surprising statement that he made. And he did, just a few months later, he announced that an executive order had been passed that he did in this is actually September 2020 to endorse the building of the Alaska to Alberta railway that would for the first time connect the lower 48 states through Alberta and into Alaska by rail. That had never been done before, still hasn't been done. It was a consortium set up, and it was based upon, when you went to their website, it's been since defunded and shut down. I'm hoping that something similar can be revived. That, again, Trump gave a tweet where he said, based on the strong recommendation of these two political figures of the great state of Alaska, it is my honor to inform you that I will be issuing a presidential permit for the A2A cross-border rail between Alaska and Canada. Congratulations to the people of Alaska and Canada. I made a documentary on this because it's a very exciting proposition to get rid of this post-industrial zero-sum paradigm that's been destroying us for 50, 60 years of globalization, consumerism. This is like an abolishment of that and a restoration of an idea that we had once seen with Lincoln and with FDR by thinking long-term, thinking about utilizing the nation state as an instrument for the good. It was based upon, if you look at their website, this is a screenshot, the growth of China and Eurasia. So their entire business strategy for building the Alaska to Canada Railway was entirely based upon the growing consumer market of China. So there was a deep appreciation for the economic positive relationships between countries that I know is something that the British imperial faction of the world despises. They fear that type of win-win cooperation on economic, a harmony of interests. There's been other things that were revived as a discussion. I still hear discussions about this, but I mean, I think Trump was in favor of this way of thinking about the Bering Strait. This is a rail corridor that had been first proposed by Lincoln in 1863 and his allies in Russia to build rail and telegraph lines across the Alaska through the Bering Strait as a way to unite the old and new worlds around this multi-generational positive way of thinking. This is a 21st century rendition featuring what some of the maglev lines might look like. And I think that the Alaska Canada Railway was bringing us closer to that. We have another image here that I selected featuring something done by the Schiller Institute some time ago that I really love of an extension of the Belt and Road Initiative with its various branches and arteries around the world, with the peak being the Bering Strait connection, which again seems like all quite good. And so if you have a Malthusian ideological death cult running a monarchical system in North America through Canada, as has been historically the case, it would always be used as a block dampener to prevent U.S., Russian, or Chinese or collaboration on things that are good. That's always been with Canada. Unfortunately, I've seen Canada most of the time serving the role of a wedge between U.S.-Russian collaboration on Arctic development, including after Russia sold Alaska to Canada, which was done for the purpose of extending what would become the Trans-Siberian to connect into the transcontinental, completed in 1868. That was originally the spirit and idea behind the sale of Alaska in 1867. So these are all good. These would, if the U.S. were to get some form of dominance over the political powers of Canada, such that things like this were done, then we could get an alternative to war, right? The Arctic could become not a domain of militarization, which it currently is, but could become a basis around which we find common ground to develop a lot of the resources and access those resources, like the Russians are much better at doing, but we need to learn because we haven't done that in Brotherhood. So that would be fantastic. There's another project that I've been inspired by. Again, this is an image by the Schiller Institute from some years ago, that there's going to be an increased amount of water crisis. There's currently a paradigm of destroying hydroelectric dams. California destroyed 4 big dams just this year to liberate the deserts, to restore deserts to their natural purity. That's deadly. It's destroying affordable electricity, water for food production from so many people. So if we go back to what JFK was looking at, what his brother Bobby Kennedy was endorsing openly, was this North American Water and Power Alliance that would green the deserts of the west coast of the United States all the way down to Mexico. That would be the sort of thing, if we could see things like that happening, that would help us leap over the limits to growth, break free of the Malthusian scarcity, controls. That would be legitimate forms of continental planning. But if it, on a negative side, what I'm seeing in 2024 now, 2025, is a different kind of language coming from Trump that it worries me, especially considering a lot of the military industrial interests that are closely aligned to Peter Thiel, to Elon Musk, which concern the hell out of me. I don't see these men as necessarily peacemakers. Whether the Palantir operation, whether Starlink, I just don't see it. They might be into avoiding World War III. That's possible. Maybe the idea has come across that unleashing nuclear Armageddon may not necessarily be in the interest of even the elite class that manage Elon Musk, who I don't think is an authentic thing unto himself. But there is a certain belligerence, like when Trump, this is a recent tweet he made saying Merry Christmas to all, including the wonderful soldiers of China who are lovingly but illegally operating the Panama Canal, always making certain that the United States puts in billions of dollars to repair money, but will have absolutely nothing to say about anything. Also, Governor Justin Trudeau of Canada, whose citizens' taxes are too high, but if we were to become the 51st state, their taxes would be cut by more than 60%. So you have a language that is unnecessarily belligerent to China, that's casting blame on China for things like the migration crisis in the Panama, which actually has everything to do with the Green Berets and American military-industrial complex, which has over 70 military bases across Latin America, including 9 in Panama alone to this day. So you got this weird psyop that he's kind of playing into. I don't know if it's just language. He'll often say things that are insane and then do something rational. I hope he's playing that game. But the other thing that concerns me on a negative side would be sort of the restoration of this North American Union idea. And when you look at, for example, the discussion of getting Greenland, extending the United States, invading Mexico to solve the drug problem, the Sinaloa thing with U.S. military might, that's discussion points that I think are very dangerous. If you have a philosophy also of going all the way back to capturing Panama, which used to be, by the way, owned by Colombia until the U.S. went in militarily at the turn of the last century, and basically carved up, took that away from Colombia and created the Panama Canal as a geostrategic point of control. If the U.S. goes and does that, well, I'm seeing the dangerous side would be the revival of this concept of the 1930s, known as the Technate of America, which is an image that can be seen here, featuring Greenland all the way down to the northern aspect of Latin America. That would be run by, basically, this was something that was done by this guy here. This guy, the second from the left. So you got on the left is an image of Howard Scott, the founder of Technocracy Incorporated. It was a major political movement in the 1930s. Just beside him is this guy named Joshua Haldeman, who ran by the name, every member of this technocracy movement, which used their little Chinese yin yang monad as their symbol. They all had a name that their names were all replaced with codes, usually involving a number and an X, enmeshed together. Joshua Haldeman's number was 10450/1. Another member was 1X1809X561. Every member, there was 500,000 members in California alone, and big in Canada. This guy, Joshua Haldeman, was the Canadian head of this agency. He got thrown in jail in 1942 for being part of a sabotage operation and basically being on the wrong side of World War II. It was a fascist organization. And this guy ends up becoming the father of a woman named May Haldeman, who marries a guy named Errol Musk. And he has a grandkid named Elon in the 70s. And after he gets out of jail, he becomes the head of the Social Credit Party of Canada, runs for office. Social Credit Party being something tied to the Theosophical organization that was set up by Madame Blavatsky and was at a certain point run by a fellow named A.R. Oraj, a follower of Gurdjieff, who gave the name Social Credit to the movement that Joshua Haldeman also ended up running. It was basically an anarcho-syndicalist organization, which was marketed to Hitler. Hitler was actually entertaining this social credit scheme as being the basis upon which the Reich could apply to their post-war world, basically a world of collectivist little mini communes run by Aryan elites and scientific managers, which is what the Technate was all about, was a grand central directorate, a Technate that would have subdirectories peppered all over the world. And yeah, they had things like, you know, Technocracy Gray as an official car from General Motors, because they had a whole fleet of gray cars that looked to me a little bit much like or has the vibe of the Tesla, you know, the Tesla gray automobile idea. Anyway, Elon Musk has spoken openly and positively about his the grandfather's influence on him. He's called for a Martian Technate. So that type of thinking bothers me. And my concern is that this thing, which also was based upon eugenics. I've got one of their Bibles. This is the Technocracy study course that was set up by Howard Scott and a grouping of these social engineers that he worked with. It was written also by this guy who's the founder of peak oil, named Marion King Hubbard, the actual founder of the peak oil theory, and a godfather of modern environmentalism, was a member of Technocracy Inc., as was this guy. There was any other, I'm not going to go through a bunch of names right now, but they put together this Bible where they are describing a hyper radical behaviorist machinery of humanity that they reject outright could possibly have any consideration of soul, natural rights. They just say it's absurd because we've never dissected a creature and found a soul, and because we can't see it materially, it cannot exist. And so the ideas of right and wrong and rights per se must only occur based upon the control of an elite class of social engineers. This is a quote from Technocracy Inc.'s study course. Again, it was the Bible, the manual for all members to study, where he says it might be remarkable that the most minute and anatomical dissection had never revealed anything that corresponded to a mind or a conscience or a will. Real scientific progress is at all times based on the correlation of objectively observable phenomenon. So a hyper-positivist materialist type. When we subject such concepts as the human mind, in quotes, to this sort of test, they rapidly fade out of existence. When we observe a human being, we merely perceive an object which makes a certain variety of motions and noises. So even though they're talking vocally about the greater good and doing things for humans, they were based upon getting rid of money, getting rid of the monetary system, using a new system of credits that would be tied to your behavior as a human machine, that the credits would be associated with energy use and consumption. But because they were also tied to the belief that the earth was, or that all of the energy was ruled by the second law of thermodynamics, and thus could only run down in time as you had more people existing consuming that energy, they believed in a closed system. So they also believed in eugenics. And yeah, basically this is, I don't have the quote, but they were promoting eugenics just like the Nazis were. One of their other elements in the study course described the idea that the human being is an engine taking potential energy in the form of chemical combinations contained in food and converting this potential energy into heat, work, and body tissue. The thermodynamic process involved, while more complicated in detail, are in exact accordance with the laws of thermodynamics and are in no essential particular different from the corresponding process in man-made engines. And again, just to be clear, this is the idea of like a more revamped modern Malthusianism. So I'm glad you asked the question about like, what is Malthus? It's based upon the concept that just like an engine from a car, when you pump, you could put in a limited amount of fuel, which as it burns the fuel to make pistons move to make the engine function, it will invariably wind down to a heat death. And so too, they say that is the perfect analog for any type of living system, or especially human system. Again, like Malthus, ignoring the existence of human creative scientific powers of eureka, of discoveries, of improving the quality of beauty, of culture. They just ignore all of that because it's absurd. It's not scientific. You can't touch culture or beauty. You can't lick it or smell it. So it doesn't exist to these hyper empiricists. And instead, what you have on the left there is a picture of basically their worshiping of thermodynamics as an immutable law of the universe, which they basically transpose the law of an engine onto the whole universe, as is wont these days, whereby in time, as you have more planets being born, more suns being born, more activity happening in the universe, there's going to be less energy to go around. So the universe is increasingly moving towards stagnation and heat death, which is a very nihilistic assumption, but one that's been really promoted heavily in academia all over the Western world. And on the bottom there is basically the image and you know, the idea that you'll always have the decrease of abundance in time. And so all that a social engineering masterclass can do in that world where discoveries don't exist and human sentiments and the soul don't exist for them is you can just manage the scarcity in a world of diminishing returns. So my concern on the negative side is that Trump is making too many compromises towards that grouping, that is sort of nudging the MAGA patriots towards becoming a perversion, a parody of themselves, whereby even a lot of good MAGA patriots that I know and like are championing the idea of going to war with China, of invading Mexico. It's a concerning thing, or who overlook the vast military industrial connections between In-Q-Tel and Palantir and Starlink, or SpaceX, which all have the same In-Q-Tel, which is again a CIA venture capital front group that spawned a variety of pseudo civilian fronts after the World Trade Center was taken down, in order to make it seem not so Orwellian that we have entrepreneurs who are now doing the work through big tech and Silicon Valley, which was, by the way, the hub of Technocracy Inc. I think that Technocracy Inc.'s operations in California became Silicon Valley in a large measure. So that was always tied to the military industrial complex from the earliest days of the Cold War. So I think that these are things that are concerning to me. I'm hoping that at the very least, the least worst idea for me right now would be that there's a faction within the oligarchy, just like there was in World War II, that realizes that their Nazi plans and utopian dreams of a world run by a new, global Roman Empire with fascist enforcers, that idea is not working according to plan, that reality is not obeying their whiteboard abstractions, and they have to abort maybe to try to fight another day. That's my least worst. So that maybe a decision has been made to pull back from going necessarily to straight hot war with Russia and China or Iran, and instead just try to consolidate some influence, maybe unleash some creative scientific progress, but in a more controlled way, maybe with the argument that this technology is coming from UFOs that we reverse engineered, which is also what they're promoting, to get people to think that the technology that they might start seeing more and more in the civilian and military sector might actually come from us being given it by aliens. That's something that's a psyop that's being promoted right now to cover up the fact of where technology actually comes from. The best scenario would be that the spirit of what Trump was trying to do in his first term, and what I've recognized the best of American leaders who usually tend to get shot at while in office or die mysteriously, are doing, which is reviving the proper constitutional traditions that perceive the nation state, the republic, as an instrument for defense of the people, the general welfare, and offense against the interests of an empire. I'm hoping that that's my best case scenario, that is still a driving factor behind this discussion of expanding the U.S. Across Canada, Canada, Greenland. I'm hoping that that's in play, and I'm hoping there's sufficient smart patriots who know their history and who have tact and influence in and around Trump, including Trump himself, who are on board with that orientation, because this other thing, I'm really, really concerns me.
Matt, I couldn't agree with you anymore based on everything you said, and I think we can even dedicate a full episode in the future to Silicon Valley and the influence that it now holds over Donald Trump. I think there's a lot of really dark stuff coming out of that Silicon Valley group. These are the people who are obsessed with eugenics and this whole pursuing of the imperialist order, but putting a new, dark, twisted, technologically advanced AI eugenics face on it. Peter Thiel, Palantir, Starlink, Elon Musk, all these sort of Mark Andreessen, all these guys. So I am concerned about this. I am very worried about this. And I honestly believe that there is some level of there's a demonic presence there. We'll see what happens. But yeah, it just really doesn't sit well with me. Everything you had to say just made me feel even worse about it. So we will see. I think it's the last thing I'll say is I think it's very interesting how Silicon Valley was like the mafia of censorship, political censorship, woke culturalism, and they created this really grotesque straw man talking about, you know, and pushing the idea of mutilating children's genitalia. They created like the worst of the worst monster, and then, you know, in a span of a couple months, they all get different hairdos. Mark Zuckerberg's got like a TikTok hairdo and looks like Jack Harlow. They're coming out and they're acting like the heroes that are fighting back against this after promoting all this madness for years. So I don't know what to make of this. I think I know what to make of this, and I don't like the way it looks. But Matt, thank you so much for joining me today. And where can people follow along with your work? Because again, I highly suggest everyone check out your work, especially your recent documentaries. It is excellent stuff.
Oh yeah, no, it was, yeah, thanks for having me on. I guess the easiest thing would be to go to canadianpatriot.org, more geopolitical focused stuff, and also all of our books. My wife and I have both published a number of books on geostrategic considerations of history, like what we've been alluding to. That's easy to find there, including our new documentaries as well. risingtidefoundation.net is a little bit more of our cultural, educational material that we produce. So people can also go to risingtidefoundation.net. And finally, I would say my Substack's been kind of the bread and butter for now. So if people want to subscribe, there's free and paid. That's matthewehret.substack.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you.